Good afternoon. Welcome to the Center for Disaster Philanthropy's webinar, The Gendered Nature of Climate Change. As you can see, the poll is still up. So if you haven't had a chance yet to fill in the poll, we'd be so thankful for your vote on what impacts of climate change do you see in your work. You're definitely able to check as many as apply. So go ahead and tick those little boxes. My name is Regine Webster, and I'm the Vice President at the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I was the founding executive director at CDP, and I like to think about myself as somebody who brings a sense of adventure, discovery, and compassion to the fields of philanthropy and humanitarian assistance, helping to build bridges between those offering solutions and those in need. I'm going to offer a few housekeeping notes. Those of us who attend webinars often probably these won't be new, but go ahead. If you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to submit any questions. We'll do our best to answer the questions at the end of the panel presentation. If you are on Twitter, please use hashtag CDP4Recovery. That's CDP, the number 4 recovery, to share and join the discussion. And please don't forget to follow us on @FundsForDisaster. At the end of this webinar, there will be a short survey. Please complete this to help us improve our webinar offerings to better meet your needs. Trust me, we really carefully review the data and the information that you share with us. And then finally, we are recording this webinar. It will be available on our website and YouTube channel shortly after this webinar is complete. Live captioning is available now via Zoom, and you can click on the closed caption live transcript to access it. We'll have more accurate captions after that will be available in the recording. I'd like now to thank our co-sponsors. This webinar is co-sponsored by Alliance Magazine, the Council on Foundations, Giving Compass, Philanthropy New York, the Women's Funding Network, and the United Philanthropy Forum. We can't do our work without our partners, and so I'm so thankful for all of their support. And before we really dive in, I just want to acknowledge, as CDP does with every webinar, that we are working on the stolen lands of the many original peoples. We recognize that Indigenous peoples have been displaced and disenfranchised from their land by the socioeconomic and cultural impacts of colonialism and disasters. The erasure of Indigenous knowledge about how to care for those lands has caused environmental destruction and degradation. CDP is committed to dismantling the ongoing legacies, systems, and structures of settler colonialism and white supremacy and their connections to philanthropy today and in the future. Despite centuries of theft, violence, and murder, this is still and always will be Indigenous land. Please join us in acknowledging the original peoples and their elders in the past, present, and future generations. So let's talk a little bit about goals for this webinar. At the end of this webinar, our hope is that grant makers will understand the intersection between gender and climate change, discover why women's priorities and needs are critical to all phases of disaster and climate-related risk reduction, mitigation, response, and recovery. And finally, we hope that grant makers will learn about funding opportunities to change the interaction between climate and gender. Let's go ahead and take a look at the results of our poll now. Okay, so in looking at what impacts of climate change do you see in your work as it relates to gender, definitely almost half of all participants are saying that women and girls spend more time involved in household activities. It's not in order. They've seen increased gender-based violence, unschooling of girls, and then followed by child marriage and sex trafficking. So clearly we're seeing in real time the effects of the gendered nature of climate change. Let's go ahead now and introduce our speakers who will be guiding us through the remainder of this hour. It truly is my honor to introduce our special guests, and I'm really looking forward to the information that they're going to share with us. Dr. Supriya Akkarkar is the director of the Center for Development and Emergency Practice, CENDEP, at Oxford Brookes University. Supriya has been working in development and emergencies for the last 25 years. She's worked in international development, she's worked with international development organizations, social movements, and civil society campaigns in the Global South on issues of gender, social equity, and building inclusive societies. Her work focuses on furthering the rights of women, gender and sexual minorities, older people and people with disabilities, displaced groups affected by disasters and emergencies, and Indigenous people. Ellen Chiwanda is an adolescent-led advocacy advisor for CARE and has more than 17 years experience in gender, girls, and women's empowerment issues, as well as education programming experience with various organizations, including local women's NGOs, civil society, and international institutions. Ellen researches the nexus between climate change and education, writing extensively on how education can build climate resilience. Working at the regional and the global level, she positions CARE as a thought leader on climate change and education. Jenna Wallace is the Director of Global Movement Partnerships and Climate Justice at the Global Fund for Women, where she leads global strategies to ensure, the cameras are coming on, good, where she leads global strategies to resource and shift power to gender justice movements advancing climate justice. Previously, Jenna led the programs team at Women First International Fund, where she co-created a trust-based grant-making model with a unique 6-year funding approach. As an intersectional and equity-focused grantmaker, Jenna has lived and worked in multiple geographies across thematic priorities with significant experience partnering with gender justice activists and movements around agroecology, just transition, land and natural resource rights, and climate emergencies. Welcome to each one of you, and thank you for taking the time to share your expertise with us. Like I said, I'm super excited to chat with each one of you today. So listen, we know, and it becomes daily increasingly clear, that the climate crisis is not, quote unquote, gender neutral. We know that disasters result in a higher death rate for women and girls, and that they are subject to the greatest impacts of climate change. United Nations Women says that this amplifies existing gender inequalities and poses unique threats to their livelihoods, health, and safety. And that climate change is a threat multiplier, meaning that it escalates social, political, and economic tensions in fragile and conflict-affected settings. Our speakers today will share how climate increases vulnerabilities for women, girls, and trans individuals. To begin this discussion, let's go ahead and start with you, Jenna. Your focus is on climate justice, not climate change or climate science. What's the lens you look through when focusing on climate justice?
Thanks, Regine, so much. And let me just start with my gratitude to Center for Disaster Philanthropy for hosting this conversation today, and also my excitement to learn from both Supriya and Ellen also today. And what you just highlighted, Regine, about climate change as a threat multiplier, I think is a really great place to start. So when we look at climate crisis through a justice lens, we're first acknowledging that climate change exacerbates existing inequalities. So people who are already systematically disadvantaged are going to feel the impacts of climate change more acutely. In other words, those least responsible for climate change happening are going to experience its most extreme consequences. So for example, if you think about an Indigenous woman who's living in a low-lying island state that experiences a lot of tropical storms, existing inequality means that not only is her community less economically prepared for disaster, but she probably occupies the land that's most prone to flooding, the least desirable land to live on. And her income and savings are probably more limited. So the cost of repairing her home might not be attainable, or relocation. And since we know that storms are happening more frequently, she hasn't recovered from the last storm. And she wasn't consulted in disaster planning, so recovery doesn't account for the fact that her livelihood was tied to plants along the coastline that was washed away. And this is just one example, but you can imagine how the impacts multiply with different kinds of identities and different kinds of climate shocks. So what if she was living with a disability, or what if she was heading a household? So a climate justice lens sees and starts from the acknowledgement of that intersectionality. And because that's at the center, climate justice then seeks solutions that address root causes. And this includes solutions that aren't typically or always linked explicitly to climate change through a science lens. And so where a climate science lens might sound like how do we reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the agricultural sector? A climate justice lens might sound a little bit more like, how can we support community-led regenerative agricultural practices to meet essential needs while also protecting and restoring the ecosystems that provide those needs? And so climate justice, it doesn't ignore science-based solutions, but it just requires them to be more holistic, governed locally, and involving the leadership of people who are most harmed and most impacted. And so finally then, because activists and movements have been organizing around root causes for a really long time, from a climate justice lens, we're looking to learn from and build on the strategies that have made social movements really successful, and apply these to climate crisis. And for me, in the face of an increasingly frightening outlook for our planet, climate justice also means that we can draw some optimism from the power and the diversity and the knowledge that's held both in gender justice movements, but also in frontline communities.
That was an incredibly helpful frame of the topic. I really appreciate that. Ellen, I'm going to ask you a really similar question. CARE has long been a champion for gender. And at CDP, we really rely on your gender analyses. So how does climate change intersect with gender for you and your work?
Nice, Mike. Thank you so much. We are so very grateful to CDP as CARE for inviting us to this webinar. I'm looking forward to not only contributing, but also learning from everyone on the call. Greetings, everyone. At CARE, thank you for that question. At CARE, we place women and girls at the center of everything that we do, all of our work and all of our programming. And in fact, when you look at the impact areas that we are currently prioritizing, you'll find that climate justice and gender equality are actually two of those impact areas globally. And now to answer your question about how gender intersects with climate change, maybe we can look at it from multiple angles. And of course, we all know that although climate change affects everyone, women and girls, the research is showing that women and girls are disproportionately affected. So if we start maybe with the household level, there are a number of different ways in which gender will intersect with climate change. But I think the big one is the workload at home. So climate change, induced events such as droughts and floods, heat waves and cold spells usually, contribute to a number of different impacts. When we look at droughts specifically, they lead to water scarcity. And what this does is that it increases workload for women at home, where they have to spend more time, they have to walk longer distances in order to find safe and potable water for themselves and for their families. This also increases the risk of abuse as they do this and as they try to provide this very important resource to their households. Needless to say, water scarcity will also contribute to challenges in ensuring that both women and girls meet their menstrual and other hygiene management needs, which are, obviously very important when you look at it from a health perspective. Limited water, especially in urban areas, will also increase, preventable diseases. And that in itself not only leads to illnesses for, women and girls and men and boys, but it also increases the burden of care on the part of women and girls in, supporting and caring for those who have fallen sick. Now, when we look at the community level, climate change is resulting in conflict for shared resources, which include water, which include firewood, but it also exacerbates challenges around food insecurity at the community level as well as the household level. And as we know, women are right at the center of, managing, not managing, but rather women are at the center of, the use of natural resources such as water and firewood. And, lastly, maybe just looking at the national level, when we look at, the current buzz around climate change, it's important also to explore and think about the decision-making processes that are involved in making decisions around climate change. And this can be, at community level, at, district level, and at national level. It's important for us to look at who is making the decisions, who is informing, the problem identification, the strategies that we are thinking about, how are women involved in that? And for us as CARE, we are saying that, women and girls, we should be really centering the voices and the agency of women and girls in those conversations, so that we are not really seeing women and girls as, victims of climate change, but seeing them potentially as agents of change and a non-negotiable part of a, response to climate change at any level, whether it's community level or national level. And so how can we start to see women being part of, activism around climate change, and how can they inform some of that, some of those discussions? Thanks.
I mean, just so how clearly that CARE has always and forever centered women and girls, Ellen, and just to hear you bring that centering and that prioritization forward as it relates to climate, it just makes so much sense, and it's just so really compelling and profound. Supriya, I want to go ahead and move over to you. What do you see as the link between gender, disasters, and climate change?
Okay, so first of all, again, thanks to CDC, Regine, and Tanya and all other colleagues who worked so hard to put this seminar together. So thank you so much for putting this seminar on a very important topic, and also inviting me and to join this wonderful conversation. Going back to your question, I think much of my work on disasters, and also generally, because much of my work has been about engaging with how do we sort of make the societies more unequal. And this really brings me back to the question of, the fact is that, most societies are very unequal societies. There are discriminations that happen because of, there are gender inequalities, and they often come from unequal social status, discriminations, gender social roles, which Ellen and also sort of spoke about, division of labor, and often, sadly, state perpetuated patriarchal policies. And there's ample examples of that. For example, you just have to look at what are the, for example, laws around, let's say, like access to land rights or housing rights. In many societies, you may find that women don't have those access to land or housing, and that's partly also because in many societies men are considered to be household sort of heads. So what happens is that basically when you have disasters, all these existing inequalities of gender, they sort of just exacerbate. They exacerbate and increase, therefore, the marginalization of women, girls, and other social identities also, which are sort of discriminated. So that's the first link. And just examples of that would be that not just women, female-headed households, but gender minorities, and also some ethnic groups, perhaps in certain contexts, who are also discriminated, marginalized. They may also find that they have less access to resources, which are so critical to adapt themselves to climate change or to recover from disasters. So if you have less resources and assets, then of course you have lesser capacities to recover from disasters and adaptation. Developing strategies that can help you enable to adapt to climate change in positive ways. So again, that just adds to their vulnerability, you can say, further marginalizations. And while we are speaking about women and girls, I think it's really important to remember that, people are very complex. There are many more social identities that we have. And you just started, I think, the whole seminar by, tribute to indigenous communities. Yeah. So I think, it's more to recognize that, there are many contextual sort of, social factors, social identities that we need to consider when we talk about women, girls, gender minorities, but also look at gender intersection with race, age, disabilities, also, indigenous people, and many other sort of, social identities. And as of now, I think, there isn't enough research. So I think, your question was, what is a link? So while there is some understanding of it, my sense is that we need to understand much more about the intersections about gender with other social identities and what are its effects, on women, men, and people who are from maybe different ethnic groups, race, women and men with disabilities, and and the effect of the climate change on these different social groups. And in that relation, I think, I also think that, we need actually much more of a disaggregated data, but also stories. And I say stories partly because I think, if you really want to understand the complexity of people and the effects on them, then I think you need narratives. You need, you need to understand their lives, their context in much more, complex ways, or really listen to their stories. And so for me, I think, that still is something, one of the gaps that really needs to fulfill. So, maybe funders can also do a bit more in that direction.
Well, Supriya, give us some examples from your research and how it's playing out in sort of real time.
Okay, so I think, I've been working now on disasters and for some time now. And what we see is, of course, that I think the climate change is only going to lead possibly to, more extreme events, and also more variability of the weather. And the variability of weather means, again, floods come at a wrong time, or the rains are at a wrong time. You sort of, more sort of heat waves coming in. And what I've found, I think, from much of my disaster research is that often, I think, some of the communities, particularly, I think, women, women, gender minorities, do not have what you could call is, assets or access to the kind of resources that are really needed to recover. And in this, I just want to give you an example of Chilean tsunami and earthquake of 2010. And this is really the work of Boria Valles, and I'm just writing a paper with Boria Valles on the Chilean disasters, Chilean tsunami. This is just a quote from a trans woman who said this: "Before the disaster, it was already difficult for me to get a job as a trans woman. With the reduced employment opportunities in the aftermath of the disaster, I started struggling economically, reaching a point of not having what to eat. The combination of all these facts led me to carry out a third suicide attempt." I mean, a lot of the stories that have come to us from transgender women in Chilean tsunami are actually very sad. And this just goes on to show that, my earlier point, which was about discriminations are exasperate. Yeah. So that's the same thing that you see. Trans women are discriminated in that society, and you just see that, they're further marginalized, they are excluded from a lot of, relief and even recovery sort of support systems, which is their entitlement. But, it's the societal discrimination, but also sometimes the discrimination by the state and also the organizations who are doing this relief and recovery services. So, so that's one of the areas where you see that, more vulnerability, more marginalization of gender minorities after the disasters. And often what you also see, again, I think Ellen and Jenna, I think, sort of alluded to that if you really want, recoveries of these people, then it's absolutely essential that they are a part of the planning processes. Yeah, and that they are a part of the community consultations when organizations decide to develop their plans for disaster response or risk reduction, strategies in their, but what you find in practice, although there are very good aspirational statements, often when it comes to actual practice, there's a much left to be desired, I think. And so you often find that, a lot of the community consultations, you find certain groups which are sort of excluded, because sometimes, you also have to, sometimes you might be doing meetings, at a time when it's actually women who have to do a housework. Yeah. So if you really don't even, if you don't understand the local context well, then it may not be your intention to exclude, but by its very nature, you're going to exclude them. Yeah. And so it's really important that, participation, which is an aspirational statement, actually is followed in practice. And again, I think, you find that a lot of the women in the female-headed households, in many parts of the world, they actually work in what is called as an informal livelihoods. You see, and or that might mean that they might be doing some home-based work, or they might be doing some, casual labor, or they might also be doing some, small petty, sort of a livelihood. And so they are not very visible. I mean, just as women, I think, are often invisible, I think what happens after the disasters is that a lot of these informal livelihoods, because they are small, they're often not very visible. And you find that, in many cases, because of the invisibility of women and also of their livelihoods, that informal livelihoods, they're not really well supported. So again, there's enough of that examples, I think, again, what happened in many disasters.
It makes so much sense, right? The informal livelihoods and access, all of the 3 points that you made, Supriya, just I'm so thankful that your research grounds what it seems to be our collective wisdom and collective intuition. So thank you for that. Jenna, let's go back over to you. And I'd love for us to take a look at one specific area that has a really clear connection to our topic. When you're looking at food security, how do climate and gender impact that?
Sure. So thanks for that question. And thanks especially to Supriya and Ellen for setting the stage so beautifully for my answer. I'm going to start with just kind of grounding us in where women fit in world food production. And so women predominate in the world food production process. They're making up about 50 to 80%, depending on where they are. And they also make up the majority of small scale farmers. And women play really pivotal roles in activities that support healthy food systems, like soil and water conservation, like selecting the most environmentally resilient seeds, and in a lot of communities, also cultivating plants that are medicinal or culturally significant. But like we've been saying, they're also the most vulnerable to food insecurity because they're less likely to have access to resources like land, technology, credit, social capital, and they bear the bulk of the care work. And so with gender inequality as the backdrop, it's really concerning to think about the fact that climate change is expected to reverse progress that we've already made towards food security and will further intensify hunger. The projected impact of climate change on major crop yields like maize and on fisheries have already been really well documented. And we know that climate change will result in the loss of more ecosystems and livelihoods. And all of these drive food insecurity. And all of these also impact women earlier and more severely. So it's not super surprising, considering women's roles in food production, that women and gender justice movements are really demanding changes to the system, to the current food system, which is a system that's really heavily industrial. In this model that we have today, women are forced off their land, or they're criminalized for defending their land or protecting their seeds. And they're really deprived of recognition as farmers, as farming as a job. Often this is framed as a part of caretaking or providing roles. And here we can also kind of draw parallels to the question that you asked Regine earlier about climate justice lens. Many gender justice and women's movements are calling for a new global food system that's rooted in food sovereignty. And so while food security can sometimes overlook the conditions under which the food was sourced, so for example, you could meet food security targets in a country, but you could meet them by sourcing food that's produced through really environmentally destructive or exploitative conditions. Food sovereignty really promotes ecologically appropriate production and distribution and consumption of food alongside social and economic justice and locally owned food systems as a way to tackle hunger. And so through this lens of food sovereignty, women are demanding things like agrarian reform, shifts towards agroecology, more indigenous and local knowledge-based production methods, tenure security, biodiversity protection, and ownership over seeds. And so supporting women's movements or women's priorities around food sovereignty is a really powerful climate solution because it more protects ecosystems and the land. It's also a really great way to support food security, but with that justice lens.
That I love that. Justice lens brings us all back together around the topic for sure. Ellen, CARE has implemented an initiative which is working to address the barriers that hinder educational access for rural girls in Zimbabwe. What are some of these climate-related and other barriers that you see?
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. So when we look at climate change, it's really having an impact on girls' education, especially in rural contexts, where a lot of the work that we are implementing on education is focused. So firstly, when we look at extreme weather events, I know Zimbabwe in 2019, you will know that we experienced Cyclone Idai, and you know, many other cyclones. And you know, they have the potential of destroying, you know, damaging schools and essentially destroying infrastructure as well as learning materials. And what this triggers is that it triggers school closures. It, you know, increases teacher and student absenteeism, and that reduces contact time with the content which children are supposed to engage with in a particular year. And all of this will culminate in affecting learning outcomes. And then secondly, climate change also limits access to water within the school itself, which, you know, has an impact on attendance, especially for girls. So what we are seeing in some of the interventions is that this is increasing menstruation-related absenteeism, where girls make the decision or are forced to make the decision to stay at home during their menses, which again, you know, comes back to, you know, missing out on content, which affects also their learning outcomes. And then, as you know, my colleagues have already, you know, alluded to, the climate crisis is increasing food insecurity and malnutrition, which, you know, we know is linked to cognitive development. It's also linked to student attentiveness, and connected to learning outcomes as well. So some of the, you know, pieces that, you know, that we've been discussing just now about food insecurity, all of that is linked to the child and their ability to, you know, to learn within the school setting. And also closely linked to that, many of the livelihoods that we see in the global south, for example, in Zimbabwe, many of them are actually linked to water. So, you know, farming activities, you know, livestock production, all of those are very much building, construction, all of those livelihoods are actually connected to water. And so water scarcity does affect, you know, families' ability to earn an income, which in itself is connected to the household being able to prioritize educational costs, such as school fees and uniforms and other materials that are required. But, you know, there are also other sort of, you know, barriers that we are seeing or impacts that we are seeing, where we see, you know, drought-driven migration by parents who are now moving to neighboring countries in order to find alternative sources of livelihoods, which in itself, you know, sort of invokes safeguarding issues, such as, you know, parents opting to put their children in what we are now calling bush boarding. And bush boarding is essentially a situation where a child now has to rent on their own closer to the school so that they can make it to school because their parents are away, which, you know, is fraught with a lot of, you know, safeguarding issues such as, you know, gender-based violence and other forms of abuse. And then we're also seeing that climate change is also pushing children, both boys and girls, into exploitative and hazardous child labor, where they are forced to kind of work and augment household income, which is also sabotaging their education. And lastly, I wanted to share that climate change is also, you know, disasters that are related to climate change are triggering humanitarian crises and increasing, you know, internally displaced people, which then, you know, and they are less likely to enroll and to also keep children in school. So these are some of the climate sort of change change related barriers that we are seeing to education, and there are many others, and they're kind of exacerbating, or I like the term that was used earlier around, multiplying the threads that were already existing, but also creating a new generation of inequalities that are kind of connecting this concept, this idea of climate change, gender, as well as education.
Ellen, what I hear so loudly from the way you just answered this question is that climate change it's woven up through and across, right? That it's both the warp and the weft, everything from school fees all the way through how children are able to live and, live and exist in the world so that they're both educated and safe, but still affected by climate. That was a really powerful answer. Okay, I'm turning now to the audience. We are about to hit audience participation time, which means we're going to move to a discussion with all of you and our speakers. So please go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of their screen. And I'll go ahead when we get to that Q&A point, make sure to pull questions out from you all here live, as well as some of the questions that were sent forth earlier this week when people registered. I do now want to ask each one of our speakers for their advice for our funders on the call. So Supriya, I'll start with you, please. How can funders further women's voices and their rights?
Okay, so I think we've shared a lot about the adverse impacts between disasters, climate change, and women's marginalization. So if you really want to change, I think what I would say is that earlier discussion was on the vicious cycle. Yeah. So the question is, how do you reverse that vicious cycle and make it into maybe a virtuous cycle? And that can only be done if you sort of, ensure that there is a real synergy between disaster mitigation, climate change responses, adaptation works with development goals that further women's equality and rights. So for me, they have to go together. You really can't only talk about, solutions without actually looking at whether that particular program is also furthering women's equality and rights. And it also meets with the SDG goal number 5. So in a way, that's something that everybody has signed to. So the sustainable development goal number 5 sits very much within this, the first point that I'm making. The second thing is, which everybody, Ellen, Jenna have sort of, really said, and I just want to reiterate that point, which is that, if you really want to make changes, then you must support initiatives that actually work with women, gender minorities, and also the program is designed in such a way that enables them to lead these initiatives as leaders. So I think, again, develop proposals, support such proposals where really the voices and the agencies of these women and gender minorities, maybe women with disabilities, are sort of supported as leaders. And the third thing is again connected with the first and the second point, which is that, show solidarities with the rights-based approaches and the initiatives for risk reduction and climate change adaptation with what I would call as a longer-term funding engagement. So if you really want change, women's rights is not, we are talking about the societal inequalities. That's going to take some time to change. And so I think if you really want to make change, then you can show solidarity, but with the groups which are really adopting the rights-based approaches, but really supporting them with longer-term funding. So not short-term funding would just not be enough for the kind of issue that we want to address.
I love the word solidarity and your use of it here, Supriya. It makes so much sense, right? And it's like, let's think that long-term approach. Let's take it and let's own that long-term approach. Jenna, the Global Fund for Women funds from a feminist perspective and looking at power and movement building. And so tell us, how can funders start getting involved in that kind of funding?
Yeah, thanks, Regina. I love this question because there's space for everybody in this kind of work, but I think sometimes the language we use and the jargon that we fall into can sometimes be super confusing or overwhelming. And I shared earlier and it's on the screen now, a representation of Global Fund for Women's strategy. And I'm not going to go into all the details, but I wanted to just have it visible so that because it spotlights some really important components and concepts within feminist feminist philanthropy. And also just kind of as a tangible offering, we do have quite a few resources on practicing feminist philanthropy, including some coming out this month through our 1.9 Rising program that you could find on our website. But to answer your question more directly, I think one way to start getting involved is to really just start with asking some questions that are foundational to funding from a feminist perspective. And so one would be, what does being a true partner look like for your work? So your approach might look totally different from Global Fund for Women or from any other organization, but what are the ways that you could involve the voices of those closest to the work that you fund in your decision-making on grants, but also on strategy? And what are some of the ways that you could cultivate trust with your partners? In what ways are you treating applicants as peers is one example. And I think shifting power is really core to our strategy, but also really core to a feminist approach to philanthropy. And something that I've learned and really taken on board is that shifting power doesn't mean passing the torch and then running the other direction. It means partnering in different ways that begin to unravel existing power structures. So another question that we can ask is, what ways could we radically reimagine funding that really meets the needs of the people that we serve? We know that organizations need core support, need long-term investment. We've heard this for a long time, and we've seen really exciting shifts towards that. But how could we even go beyond that? How could we be more creative? What if we reimagined multi-year grants to go well beyond the 2 or 3 years that the funding community is often looking at? How could we be more creative about what reporting looks like? Could it be more accessible? Could it be video? Could it be WhatsApp? Could we interrogate concepts that we've had around for a long time, like absorptive capacity? How do we redefine those? How do we look at them? And another question to ask would be, how can you share? And not only this sharing in the sense of sharing your learnings, but also sharing your talent through collaboration. I think because we fund movements and I work with movements really closely, we're always talking about collective action. And there's so much opportunity for funders as well to do collective action in a lot of different ways. So there's another thing within feminist philanthropy and feminist activism, I think, that is this piece around rest and joy and celebration. And I think that often gets missed because we're so busy and there's so much urgency around this work. But making spaces for celebration, for solidarity, like Supriya mentioned, that's really important. And I think it's foundational to a feminist approach or an equity approach. So I know I've raised more questions than answers, but I think, funding from a feminist perspective really starts with listening and interrogating power systems and then reimagining them to be more fair and equitable. So I think diving into some questions and really just exploring and being creative and curious is a really good way to start.
Jenna, I'll say nice use of the word interrogating. Wow, like really flipping that meaning on its head to make us get critical and thoughtful about why we do what we do, how we do. Ellen, help us from your perspective. What are some of the strategies that funders could use to improve this situation for women, girls, and trans individuals?
So, coming from the education side of things, I think I'm just going to make a few points around this. One of the pieces I'd like to put forward is that education is an undervalued pathway in the response to the climate crisis, and more specifically, thinking about how we can invest in the dual relationship between climate justice and gender justice in it, including the education of adolescent girls. So here, investing not only in understanding how climate change is keeping girls out of school, but also trying to understand how educating girls in itself can help to ensure that we have a more robust response to climate change at any level. And then secondly, I think, my colleagues have already talked about how we can strengthen the planning and the response to climate change, especially centering the voices and agency of girls. We know for a fact that women and girls are the ones who are at the center of, using, natural resources that are affected by climate change. And so how can we center their experiences? How can we make sure that they have agency around, these discussions on climate change? So if we are convening conferences, who should we be talking about? If we are thinking about research, who should we be talking about? And how can the women and the girls themselves actually be part of leading some of that action research so that it can inform some of the decisions that we are making? But also, I think it's important for us, when I think about household work and workload and how that affects women, not only at household and community level, but how it's also keeping girls out of school. How can funders invest in, climate smart technologies? So for example, in one of the pilots that we ran in Zimbabwe, just providing a solar powered water facility and ensuring that water is available at the school all year round. That has ensured that, it increased attendance. It also increased, school feeding activities. It also increased, learning outcomes within that school that we started that initiative. So it's amazing how, investing in climate smart technologies can actually end up bringing about positive changes for girls, but also positive changes for women in return, so that as we build strong, as we develop and work with strong girls, they themselves grow into strong women who can make decisions and who can really make sure that their families are strong and healthy. So those are some of the ways that I think, and of course, building, climate resilient education systems is part of that, so that, girls can, be in a space that provides opportunities for them to become better leaders of tomorrow.
So much in that one answer, Ellen, right? Like least of which is let's use all the technology at our fingertips for all of the good that we can make it be. We're going to turn now to Q&A. So this is one of my favorite times, which is when you're going to see all four of our faces on screen. And like I said earlier, I'm going to toggle back and forth between questions that were sent to us in advance and questions that have come through this Q&A. Ellen, I'm going to start with you on this, but I know your background is much more education. So if you can tell me if you don't want this question. We know that women and girls are injured or killed at higher rate during a disaster. What is it that funders can do to help improve that situation?
I think it goes back to a number of different pieces, and I can say a little bit and then others can also jump in. I think it's a piece around how women and girls, the education around climate change is more academic, so really more for them to learn within the classroom, but without extrapolating that to how does climate change affect you on a day-to-day basis, understanding how, floods can affect children. And in fact, some of the research that I've done has actually brought about such issues where girls are talking about mental health challenges associated with them worrying about crossing a flooded river when they are going back to school. So it's about how do we make sure that what girls and eventually women are learning within the classroom can help them to navigate the challenges that are being brought about by climate change. But more specifically, how can funders also invest in skills? How can girls be taught to swim? How can they be taught to, anticipate and to see danger, and so that they are not crossing, so very sort of basic life skills that help to position girls as not only, victims, but to see themselves as part of helping themselves and others to avoid and to prevent challenges associated with such disasters.
A skills-based approach. It's the answer that's right in front of you, but boy, did you need to say that out loud for me. That was terrific. Thank you, Ellen.
Yeah.
Jen, I think this question is best posed for you. It's the first question that came through our live Q&A. How can we operationalize Indigenous knowledge in the contemporary wait, hold on, I read that wrong. How can we, in the contemporary global knowledge with respect to climate change? In part, Indigenous knowledge is often underlooked in the climate change negotiation, debate, and implementation.
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. It's a really important one, and I think I could probably speak for an hour, and I'm sure my colleagues could as well. And I think one answer to the question would be that we really need to work on redefining what is knowledge and what is seen and respected as knowledge. And so redefining that through tools that we have available to us, like community-based action research. This is one methodology of research that kind of flips the script a bit on more academic research that we're used to. And I think that funders can support more of that kind of research, because that's what helps lift things up into more of these global dialogues. If it's respected as research, then we'll get more traction. And so funding more of that kind of research as knowledge production, as well as advocating in the spaces that we're part of, pushing towards recognition of these kind of community-based knowledge production systems as research is another way. We have in this group, I see a lot of participants. I know we're in so many spaces, and collectively we can make a difference in redefining some of these concepts. And also within academia and working with researchers and partnering with universities, how can we further help Indigenous academics be published, get peer reviewed, get into academia in ways that they haven't been before included. And so, yeah, I know there's lots of other answers, but that would be where my mind goes initially.
That's terrific, and I appreciate your attention to research there. Okay, I'm gonna ask you guys a question, but hold I'm gonna give you a minute to think about it, and I'm gonna ask you guys to do a lightning round answer. There's several questions in our Q&A that are related specifically to data and stories. So can you, each one of you, when I call on you in a heartbeat here, list out one or two like websites or studies? So just like in kind of a bulleted lightning round fashion. But first I'm going to ask Supriya a question. If you could help us understand how climate change uniquely impacts trans folks more than cisgendered people. And then I'm going to add in this element from the Q&A also that talks about impacts on transgender men or those who identify as third gender or non-binary. So I know it's a lot of a question, but if you could loop it all in, that would be terrific.
Yeah, so I think in terms of, I was just looking at the live questions. There is now a lot of research on, gender and disasters, and I've just sent a link, which gives one, website where you can access some of those studies. If not full, at least you get a flavor of them. But when it comes to gender minorities, I think there's still a lot, that we still need to be understood. It is still, you could say, it has been one of the more invisible groups, one of the more marginalized groups when it comes to research and understanding their own experiences. There is an increasing number of, studies coming out, and some of the studies are really led by, academics who are themselves, gender minorities. So, and that's an exciting thing. But I mean, on the other hand, I think, we need more stories, we need more understanding. So that data, I think, that's an area which definitely, I think, needs to be supported, maybe by funding, and also every actor, whatever they're doing, whether an operational disaster work or, an academic working on gender, I think do need to bring in that perspective. Yeah, in all the studies that we do, looking at gender beyond binary. So that's the only way we'll get, I think, get to know more about the impacts. I don't know whether that I have answered that question.
You did. Yeah, you did. Definitely. I mean, it's a hard question to ask and answer in the space of this much time, right? It's probably multiple dissertations worth, but you did terrific for this micro time we've got. All right, now to my lightning round for you three. Ellen, one or two resources, research papers, websites that you'd recommend for some data on this topic?
Thanks very much. And I know I think I promised to share with CDP some work that we've done recently as CARE, just capturing some of our own evidence from Mali, Somalia, Zimbabwe, and Timor-Leste around climate change. Of course, it will have climate change, gender, and education coming from the education side of things, so that, you know, I can share with you, Regine, and then you can share with the constituency if possible.
Yes.
I'm also at the moment actually working on some research here in Zimbabwe that is exploring, you know, the role of adolescent girls' education and agency in, you know, in the context of locally led climate, you know, action. So that's interesting. Look out for that. Actually, I think I have a journal paper that's coming out soon. And I can also share that for the constituency. Otherwise, I know that there are many other organizations that are trying to churn out research, but we know that maybe we don't have as much empirical evidence as we need. And so I think Jenna did talk about how we can make sure that we are investing in research, and not just research by researchers, but exploring ways in which the girls themselves and the women can be part of, you know, contributing their voices to knowledge generation.
That's terrific. And yes, send over and we will absolutely send out. Jenna, how about you?
Sure. So on the stories side, Shifting the Power Coalition is a network based in Fiji, but across the Pacific Islands. And they have recently created a really beautiful video that highlights women across the Pacific's experience of climate change. And it's not super long, and I know that you can find it probably through their Facebook, through their website. So that's Shifting the Power Coalition. Diva for Equality is another group based in Fiji and working throughout the Pacific Islands, and they did a really great community-based participatory action research. And so I think you can find it there on their site. It's a great example of kind of storytelling and really community-led research that that we can lift up as academic. And then I would say, not to plug ourselves, but Global Fund for Women has a lot of stories throughout our website and throughout our social media. And we really try to make sure that we're lifting up the voices of the folks and the movements that we work with. And our social media team is incredible. So I think they do a great job of that. And the 1.9 Rising program that I mentioned is we do often use that as a platform to share stories as well.
Priya, how about you?
Sorry. Did you?
Oh, this is, so what resources, websites would you recommend to participants to further research some of the data, the research and the stories as it relates to the gendered nature of climate change?
Yeah, so I have actually put in a link actually in the, I've given a live answer to that. So you can look at that on the, the data, there is definitely a site in UCL, which has given a lot of, I think, which has sort of created you could say a bibliography of a lot of work which has been done on gender and gender impacts of disasters. So I don't know if you can send it to everyone. I'm also trying to put up some more resources, but I can't see, where can I put them?
You can send them to me and I'll make sure that all of our participants receive them.
Okay. I think I'll do that then.
We'll just share the share.
I also wanted to share my recent paper actually, which is on disaster risk reduction and furthering women's rights, because that actually engages with a lot of the previous research which has been done, but at the same time taking note of what needs to be done again. So it sort of consolidates a lot of learning from the earlier research. So I will send it to you.
Yes, and we'll share out.
Please share that.
Okay, good. Well, this is my least favorite time of the webinar, which is where I have to say that this is all the time that we have for questions for today. So as I begin to wrap up, I just want to provide the audience with some actionable thoughts from our conversation. Threefold. First is to really consider each person's unique needs. Not all needs are the same. We often just look at people as this monolithic block. And so it's really important to understand that there are unique needs for women, girls, trans individuals that are simply not experienced by men, boys, and cisgendered individuals. The second is to embrace leadership from impacted individuals. people are not passive beneficiaries who just need to be given services, and really increasing leadership opportunities for those impacted will help create better outcomes. And then finally, we need to all recognize climate's broad impact. Climate and disasters impact more areas than might be expected. It's really important to understand the way issues such as human trafficking, gender-based violence, migration, food security, or education, just to name a few, are affected by climate change. So those are just our simple, but not so simple takeaways. But we do have lots of expert resources to help you on your journey to understand the gender nature of climate change. From our issue insights on our CDP website to our disaster profiles to our disaster philanthropy playbook, we provide numerous resources for those planning disaster funding. We also have a monthly newsletter full of information, regular blogs, including our What We're Watching blog that highlights disasters around the world. Our staff team, we're always available to provide guidance. And if you need more in-depth assistance, we also provide various consulting services. Go ahead and take a look at our website for more information at disasterphilanthropy.org. Our next webinar is going to be held on Thursday, August 10th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And we're going to be looking at disaster case management, navigating recovery one person at a time. After that, we're taking a break in September, but we'll be back in October, on October 12th, to discuss funding low attention disasters. In order to respect everyone's time, I'm going to bring us really quickly to close because we're already a minute over. I want to thank our co-sponsors, and I also sincerely want to thank Supriya, Jenna, and Ellen for taking the time to share their insights with us today. If you have some questions or thoughts that weren't addressed in our webinar, please go ahead and email my colleague, Tanya Gulliver Garcia, at tanya.gulliver-garcia@disasterphilanthropy.org. Thank you so much and have a great afternoon.